Good afternoon. This is the Bob Unger Show. And today we have really a great privilege to listen to a fella that I saw probably 3 or 4 months ago. He has a YouTube channel called The Rebel Capitalist. And this is George Gammon I'm speaking about, my guest. And he really touches on every subject and kind of puts it all together. In the dictionary, the derivation of the word intelligence means to make connections. Intelligent people can look at seemingly disparate events and see that they form a pattern that almost fits like a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle, and they put it together, whereas other people will see the events in isolation and never link them. And so if you go on George's channel, you will get more education. And I mean that. And people who know me know that I read 8 hours a day for 7 days a week. I don't know how I made 3 babies, but it was different. But at any rate, you listen to George, you don't need to go to Wharton. You don't need to go to any of these pathetic Marxist schools that are basically funded by the Federal Reserve and the drug companies. You need to get to truth. And George really gives you the truth. So George, give me a little bit about your background, because I'm always curious, as I told you before the show, what makes a guy like you, who's obviously intelligent and articulate, and my wife said you're also very handsome. She's a big critic. What makes a guy like you all of a sudden venture where most will not intellectually or spiritually venture?
Well, I think I've always been intellectually curious ever since I was a kid. Unfortunately, that didn't translate into good grades. Quite the opposite. I flunked out of high school, and I was always battling with teachers. I got in a lot of trouble as a kid. I was getting suspended from school all the time, went to juvenile court, just pretty much the opposite of what you'd expect from someone who might be successful later on in life, or how most people, let's say, financially successful. And I got out of, I started my first business in 1998. And that was a t-shirt business. And it just kind of felt like the right thing to do. I was never one of those people that sat down and said, okay, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. It just kind of felt, it was just kind of, I kind of came into it naturally from a standpoint of, I was at a point in my life where I decided, okay, what do I want to do next, or what's the next move here? And I thought, well, a lot of my friends borrow shirts, so I'll make a t-shirt company, because for whatever reason, what the shirts I select, all my buddies like them, so maybe people will buy them, type thing. And so that was the first business venture. Of course, it did horribly. It was never a success, but I was working graveyard at the Golden Nugget in Vegas, valet, so I could fund this business. I was working from 10 at night to 8 in the morning. So the first lesson is make sure you work hard and you're willing to sacrifice things other people aren't willing to sacrifice. But I got a little bit better, and as the businesses changed, I started to figure out kind of what worked and what didn't work. And then at 2007 or so, right around the age of 34, I was a quote unquote millionaire, self-made millionaire. And I guess so I'd achieved a certain degree of success then. In 2012, I retired because I found that the whole reason for making money in the first place was to have freedom. And in growing my last business to over 100 employees and 24 million in annual revenues, I found that I had less freedom than I did when I was 18 years old and didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And so that's kind of when I hung it up. And I had a little bit of money saved up, because I had some businesses that failed miserably, and I had a few that did well. Fortunately, I had a little more, or I made a little bit more than I lost. So I had some money saved up, but I didn't have enough to where I could just sail off into the sunset and live life comfortably, or how I'd grown to enjoy life. I didn't have that much. So I needed to get about a 5 or 6% return on my money to make sure that I never had to draw down my savings, and I didn't have to adjust my standard of living at all. So I got into real estate investing. I was in Singapore, and that kind of is what got me down the personal liberty path as well, because I started studying Milton Friedman, and just ran across him in Singapore while I was going through some YouTube channels waiting for dinner. And that took me into Thomas Sowell, and then I started studying a lot of the investors and guys in the space who I really admire still to this day. My favorite, Jim Rogers, but guys like Schiff and Jim Grant and Mark Faber, Rick Rule, Doug Casey. And I really knew at that point in time, okay, if I'm going to invest, the way what comes natural, what seems to be a good fit for me is, or what really resonates with my personality, is by buying things when they're cheap and selling them when they're expensive. So that's kind of what I try to do. And at the time, 2012, real estate was cheap. So no one wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So that's how I initially got involved with real estate investing, which turned out to be a pretty good move, some good ROI there. But actually going back, I remember now, in 2009, I kind of got into a battle with the AG in the state of Connecticut. And I won't mention any names, but let's say this guy is so morally upright that he lied about being in the Vietnam War. So
Oh, yeah.
type of character you're dealing with there. But he was the AG in Connecticut. I really, like I said, I got into a big battle with him. And I found that we lived in a country of men and not law. And what he did to me, I thought could only happen in China or in communist Russia. And so when I saw it happen in the United States, it gave me a whole new perspective on the reality of politicians, and that they're not only going to pursue their own self-interest, like all of us do, but they are in my opinion, they're the dregs of our society, because we've set up a system where we've centralized power to such a degree that the only people that want that type of power are the people that we don't want to have that type of power, and people that are willing to say anything to buy a vote, people who have no principles, they have no belief system. Those are the people who, unfortunately, who do well in politics. So,
And those are their better traits.
yeah, exactly. So those are the people that gravitate towards that power.
Yeah.
And that's when I started to realize it. So anyway, fast forward to 2014 or so, I got pretty good at the real estate investing game in the United States, making quite a bit of money. But as an entrepreneur, I actually made more money overseas, believe it or not. And so I thought, okay, well, if I made all this money overseas as an entrepreneur, if I saw opportunity, if I was able to leverage my skill set, maybe I can do that in real estate as well. So I started investing in South America. And then in 2015, I went to Colombia because at this time I knew a little bit about macro, and I had been obsessing over it since 2012, and just listening to every single podcast, every single audiobook that I could on the topic. And I knew that oil was cheap. If you recall, oil got down right around $30 a barrel, a little under, back in 2014. Didn't get to negative 40 like it did this time around, but it got under 30 if I recall. And so I know, okay, oil is cheap on a historic basis adjusted for inflation. I don't know anything about oil. I don't know anything about commodities. I thought to myself, but what I do know is real estate. And I know that if I can go in and buy the Colombian peso, since it's loosely tied to the price of oil, if I could buy an asset like real estate denominated in pesos, it would be a way to kind of express that view, that long oil view, with something that was in my wheelhouse. So that was kind of the genesis of me starting the real estate venture in Colombia, which I'm still doing today in Medellin, Colombia. But that takes us to 2019, where now I had a team of 20 or 30 people that were working for me and buying these properties and either remodeling them and selling them or keeping them in a rental portfolio. And I thought, well, these TV shows are so popular in the United States, these HGTV shows, why wouldn't they be popular in South America? And just always having that entrepreneurial mindset and probably having way too much confidence in my own ability, I went down to the local TV station and pitched them on the idea of me not only producing this TV show, but me being in the TV show. And keep in mind, I don't speak Spanish. So I think that would have been a roadblock for most people that would have prevented them in even thinking about the idea more than 30 seconds. But for some reason, us entrepreneurs, we like to tackle things that most people wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, and seem to believe with a lot of confidence that there's a good chance that we achieve success. So anyway, did that. The show was actually very popular. And at the end of the first season, 13 episodes, I had hired all the editors, all the camera people, and we were just waiting for the second season, maybe a few months or so. And so I thought, well, I want to keep these people working. So I started the YouTube channel. And that was in the maybe June or so of 2019. And initially it was just about real estate, because I didn't think anyone would ever want to watch a video on macroeconomics. But that was really what I was passionate about. That's what I really enjoyed. That was kind of that was my obsession. So if I was at dinner, as an example, I really wouldn't talk real estate, believe it or not. I would much prefer to talk about macro. So I did a couple videos on macro, and sure enough, those are the ones that became extremely popular. And the real estate videos never really got off the ground. So that's what has brought me to where I am today. Now the YouTube channel has, I think, maybe 240,000+ subscribers. The George Gammon channel. We started the Rebel Capitalist show, to your point, where now I get to interview all the people that I looked up to for so many years. It's definitely a huge honor. And we started Rebel Capitalist Pro. I just started a new YouTube channel just last week called Rebel Capitalist, where I'm just doing the news like 2 to 3 times a day. We got a podcast, and it just seems to be growing exponentially. So I'm really—
Well, you're filling a very important vacuum, because as you probably know, even though I'm a lawyer, I can tell you that education today is absolutely worthless in terms of government education and establishment education. The more you go, the dumber you get.
Yeah.
For me, my epiphany was when my first son came home from this very expensive neighborhood that I live in, where the schools are, quote unquote, the best that exist.
Mm.
And I had been a graduate of the Bronx High School of Science, which was a legendary school in the 1960s. And I hadn't realized how dumbed down this country had become.
Mm.
My son brought home a reading curriculum, and I took one look at it and I said, the only way you would give a child this curriculum is if you wanted to make him illiterate.
Right.
And then I began to meet people like Alex Newman, who interviewed you at Jekyll Island, and he wrote a great book called The Crimes of the Educators. And in that book, he actually proves that this is done by design, because the behavioral scientists who write the curriculums know that if you don't teach intensive systematic phonics the way Noah Webster used to teach more than 200 years ago, the kids will be maybe nominally literate, but they will never be able to read the Federalist Papers or the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence.
Right. Or the Federal Reserve.
Now we have a population dumbed down by the moron tube. And that's why guys like you are so important, because anyone who goes to your channel, they never have to go to school. Anyone who wanted to understand the economic system and how it works, or how to judge when to buy real estate and when not to buy real estate, all they have to do is go to your lecture. It's way better. My son went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Ivy League, quote unquote. And when you go to UPenn Law School, you're allowed to go to all the classes at Wharton without paying.
Okay.
As a senior in law school, he would sit in. And it's all absolute garbage. It's a lot of mathematics. But as Ludwig von Mises writes, economics is human action. behavior. It doesn't have to do with algorithms. And look at these geniuses that predicted today the retail numbers. Was it yesterday? The retail numbers would be down 0.1. Well, it was down 0.7.
Yeah, or the jobs numbers
Not
too.
only were they wrong, they were off by a factor of 7
Yeah, right.
times wrong. And these are the imbeciles who are our central planners.
Right. Right.
Of course, people buy into that system and are completely fooled, or they want to be fooled. I don't know which. But for me, that's what woke me up.
Yeah.
I began to get into Austrian economics. I met Peter back in 2004 when everyone was saying, he's a nutcase. He was saying this, real estate situation is going to get pretty bad. And, people like yourself and like Peter and so many other great people, they are going to be pariahs in this society. So I know it's a difficult thing to do, but if you can, for the people listening and who will listen, put into perspective the economic situation we face within the environment of this global monstrosity that is now assembling itself. You did a great video on the Great Reset. In fact, Alex Newman, who we already mentioned, wrote this article.
Yeah.
Great Reset, New American, great information. And it's interesting, Alex points out that Klaus Schwab, who, as you point out, looks like a character out of a James Bond movie.
He talks like it too, yeah.
All he needs is the white cat. He says that we have to have the Great Reset because of COVID. And then the moderator at this speech says, "Thank you, Klaus.
Yeah.
No, you've been working on this for years." The guy just said that it's a reaction to COVID. And then the moderator says, "Oh, you've been working on it for years."
Yeah, he has. This Great Reset is nothing new for the World Economic Forum, that's for sure. I think if I was going to kind of outline the basics for someone who didn't have a background in Austrian economics, or I think just people having common sense, where you've got to start is the fact that this year alone, the United States will increase their debt by, call it $5 trillion. Now, trillions of dollars, we're getting callous, I think, as a society to how much money that actually is. But to put things into context, for the first 220 years of the United States existence, so from 1776 to 1996, the US federal government accumulated $5 trillion in debt. That's the first 220 years. Now this year we will accumulate the exact same amount. So where does that lead? What happens with an economy is, and Schiff as a great example of this, it very much like a heroin addict or a drug addict. Once you start to give it the monetary stimulus or the monetary drugs of government deficit spending, or now just debt monetization, and the government spending that money directly into the economy through, let's call them stimulus checks, you're building the economy around that system, just like the Venezuelan economy was built around oil. So when the price of oil goes from $100 a barrel down to, let's say, 30, you got big problems because you're a one-trick pony. You had all your eggs in one basket. The economy wasn't diverse enough to be able to stand on its own 2 feet when you introduce just free market principles of price discovery, right? So going back to the United States, unfortunately, it started back in the 1990s with the Fed put and Alan Greenspan, where every single time we were going into a recession, or what should have been a recession, which would have cleaned out the system, by the way, we decided that we didn't want to take any of the medicine and they would drop interest rates artificially low. And then, of course, in 2007, they not only did that, but they started quantitative easing, which was, remember when quantitative easing first came out, this really illustrates my point, it was not quantitative easing 1. Remember, they didn't have a number for it because Bernanke didn't say that we would need quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, 4, infinity. He just said these were extreme measures that we have to impose right now, and then we're just going to gradually pull them back. The economy will recover, and we'll never know the difference. And we don't want to feel that pain. And then, of course, we started bailing out all these huge banks, corporations on Wall Street. Again, this is going back to 2008, the GFC. Unfortunately, what we did is we just gradually built our economy around 3 things: asset prices, or now asset bubbles, debt, and confidence. It's the exact same thing as Venezuela building their economy around oil. So now we have to make sure that asset prices remain elevated at all costs, because if asset prices go down, our entire economy collapses. We also have to make sure that there's more and more and more debt in the system. And if the private balance sheet can't handle it, meaning the average Joe just cannot take on any more debt because their income won't support it, well, we need to drop interest rates. If that happens with the corporate sector, the corporate balance sheets can't expand any further. Well, now the debt has to go to the sovereign balance sheets. And that's why we're seeing the United States debt just literally, literally double every 4 years. I mean, it starts with Obama and Trump. The debt increased almost 100%, if my memory serves me right. I mean, I think when he started, the debt was right around 18 trillion. Excuse me. Now it's 28 trillion. So no, it only went up by 10 trillion. So not quite 100%, but you see the direction it's going. We have to take on more and more and more. It goes just back to the analogy of the drug addict. Once you get addicted to heroin, you have to have more and more heroin in order to have the same effect. In order to feel the same high, you have to have more of the injection. And it's the exact same thing now. In order for our economy to just be quote unquote normal, or to have a V-shaped recovery, although it's not, there's a V-shaped recovery in the stock market, not the economy. But in order for us to get back to a level that most of us would deem acceptable, it requires more debt, more monetization of the debt from the Federal Reserve, more what most people would consider money printing, that's growth of the money supply in the real economy. And currently they're doing it through all of these stimulus packages. We saw last night, Joe Biden came out and introduced his $1.9 trillion stimulus package that I want to point out, he said was just the first step. He's going to introduce another stimulus package, even if this goes through. He's going to put forth another stimulus package in February that will more address green energy and some other initiatives that he has, which of course will be even more than the $2 trillion that he proposed last night. And how do we pay for that? Goes back to what I was saying with the debt being monetized. See, in the past, in a healthy economy, what would happen is when the government had a deficit, they would issue treasuries, and the treasuries would be purchased by an entity in the private sector, whether it was a foreigner, maybe in China, or someone within the United States. So they're pulling dollars outside of the system, or they're pulling dollars from the system. They're taking those dollars outside of the system, and then they're just re-spending them and reallocating them to a different group. But they're kind of just circulating the dollars, right? The reason I've said the Fed is monetizing the debt several times is because now that's not really happening. What's happening now is the federal government is spending the money, therefore deficit spending. So they're having to issue those treasuries, but now what's happening is the Fed is buying those treasuries directly. So what's the difference? In order to buy those treasuries, the Fed has to create bank reserves just out of thin air. They just literally go to the treasuries account and type in more digits, more numbers. And so those bank reserves are what the treasury backs up, or what backs up those checks that the treasury sends out. So when the treasury sends those checks out to the average Joe, they deposit them into their account. Now all of a sudden, the amount of dollars in circulation in the real economy has increased on net balance. You see, where if the Fed isn't monetizing the debt, if they're not buying those treasuries directly, what's happening is they're taking dollars out and putting them back in. So on net balance, you have the same amount of dollars. And that's why when you look at the Fed's balance sheet now, it's just, it's gone vertical in 2020. Now it's kind of leveled off, but it's still increasing dramatically. Same thing with M2 money supply. It seems to be there's more of a it seems now there's more of a correlation between the Fed's balance sheet and money supply. That's because the Fed is monetizing most of the debt. So if I had to kind of give people the 30,000 foot overview of the US economy and what is happening now, that's kind of how I'd describe it.
What do you say to all the drones that say to me, oh, the minute the vaccine gets into the population, the economy will be perfect, and it'll be what Mr. Trump, the so-called capitalist right-winger, what he called a super V, and it's just the coronavirus that's the problem. What would be your response to that?
Well, I was watching an interview yesterday with Jeff Gunlock, who's one of my favorites, and he used the analogy of Humpty Dumpty. And I think that's something we can all relate to. We all know the story when Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, and none of the king's men can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it's the same thing with our economy. Those people, the drones or whatever that are talking to you, they assume that the economy was healthy going into the virus, and that would be an inaccurate assumption. Just for the simple fact that if the economy is healthy, why do we need 0% interest rates?
The metaphor I use is when the maid that comes in once a week to help clean the house, sometimes I see that she's putting the proverbial dirt under the carpet.
Yeah.
And eventually, when you pull back the carpet, the place is still dirty.
Right.
And this is kind of like coronavirus. The so-called coronavirus simply peeled back the carpet on a rotting corpse of an economy.
Yeah.
And the doctor hasn't pronounced it dead yet.
Yeah, well, an economy that was addicted to drugs. So again, I'm going to go back to that heroin addict. You've got an economy that just constantly needs more and more drugs. Now, at face value, you can say, well, yeah, the person's alive. Well, sure, they're alive, but they're far from healthy. And that's the economy prior to COVID. So then COVID comes in. Now we've got, I was reading an article the other day that was saying potentially 60%, 60% of the small businesses that had to close down due to COVID are never opening again. They're gone. They're done. So, and that was, the number was north of 100,000 small businesses around the United States. And people need to understand that our economy, or the job growth, let's say, in our economy, is not really Google. It's not Facebook. It's not even Tesla or General Motors. The backs of small business and mid-sized business. So if you have all of these businesses, more than 100,000 going bust and never coming back again, I don't see how you could argue that we're going to have a V-shaped recovery if we have all of that economic activity that's gone, all those jobs gone. They're just not coming back. And people say, well, people will start new businesses.
The other drone comment, the other drone comment is on that point. Oh, it doesn't matter if the economy has nothing to do with the stock market, because everyone has a 401k, and so they'll get rich from the stock market, and that will make the economy great.
Okay, well, that's very easy. So let's assume that we're on a deserted island and we have a chest full of $1 billion, but the only thing around us are coconuts and some sand and some salt water. Are we wealthy? The answer would be no, because we have nothing. We can't do anything with those pieces of paper. Just like in Venezuela, every single person there is a billionaire. Are they wealthy? No. The wealth of a society is not measured by how many currency units it has. It's measured by how many goods and services it can produce efficiently. So if the economy is producing fewer goods and services, I don't care how much money you're creating or how many currency units you're creating, the society is getting poorer. So unfortunately, people associate a green piece of paper with wealth, and maybe that goes back to the flaw in the school systems that you were referring to earlier.
That's a very good point. That's an excellent point. So, how do you tie in COVID, the economy, and what's happening globally with our friend Klaus Schwab? You can tie that up in a little bow for the listeners.
Yeah, boy. I think Klaus in the World Economic Forum, let's call them the central planners, because whether it's the World Economic Forum, the political elite, the corporate elite, for that matter nowadays, or the IMF, the World Bank, they all want more central planning. That's at the core of their, let's say, belief system. So they feel as though we are all rubes and left to our own devices, we're going to destroy the planet. And just because we're so stupid, and we need our intelligent leaders to manage our lives for us so we don't destroy everything in our path. This is kind of, in my opinion, how they think. And I'm not just coming to these conclusions just randomly. If you go to their website and read their posts, and you got to read a lot of them. You can't just read them in isolation. You have to, like you're saying before, you got to read like a ton of them and kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. But and they explicitly talk about their Great Reset agenda. It's not tinfoil hat stuff. It's right on their website. So if you look at what their Great Reset agenda is, and then you look at something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, it is something they've been talking about since, let's call it 2016, 2017. Now, you can go two different directions. You can see that you could say that they are just opportunistic, and that this is an agenda they've been trying to push. So when we have COVID, they say, okay, now's the perfect time. There's people who would argue that they've been planning this and there was no catalyst. So they wanted to be maybe more proactive. I'll leave it at that.
Self-starters.
Yeah, so we don't get in trouble with you. But regardless of how this came about, or as far as the virus, it is what it is. It's here, and it doesn't change their Great Reset. And I think if we really want to connect the dots and think about probabilities, to me, you have to go back to communism. And I'll probably go off on a tangent here. So if I'm going off on too far of a tangent, just
No, it's the right tangent. It was exactly where I was going.
Yeah. If you look at Marx himself, he actually didn't see capitalism and Marxism as competing ideologies or competing economic ideas. He saw them as kind of almost complementing one another, in the sense that you needed capitalism to take a society out of feudalism. And you couldn't have communism. You couldn't go from feudalism to communism. That would not work. You had to go from feudalism to capitalism, because he acknowledged that capitalists are very good at creating goods and services and creating industry. And they're really, really efficient, those darn capitalists. But what he saw is capitalism getting to a point that they, and I don't know if Marx ever referred to it as this, but what a lot of Marxists refer to as late stage capitalism, or end stage capitalism. So this is a point where the capitalists themselves have squeezed all the blood out of the turnip they possibly can. They've started to squeeze workers, they've started to decrease their wages, and now they can't increase their profit margins at all. So what they start doing is speculating on assets, which in their minds gives us these asset bubbles that we've been seeing over the past, call it couple decades here. And then they, while at the same time they're turning on their employees, which decreases the amount of customers they actually have, because if they're decreasing the pay for the employees to increase their margins, those employees have less money to spend in the real economy. So you have this kind of feedback loop that is that's self-sustaining, and it's just bringing the whole society down further and further and further, and it's destroying all of the good things the capitalists did in the first place to get us to this point. So Marx believed that it was the role of the communist or the Marxist to come in at the point where they recognize this late stage capitalism and to, by whatever means necessary, take the means of production away from the capitalists so that they could propel society forward, and so that they could create a society that was actually producing goods and services even more efficiently than the capitalists. And the reason there's such an urgency there, and I think an urgency that you see with a lot of the movements that are on the far left today, is because in their minds, they truly believe that if they don't create a revolution now, today, in the United States, that the capitalist system is just going to feed on itself and is going to completely collapse and take us right back down to where we started with feudalism. And then we're just going to have to start that whole process over again.
So, a few good books on the subject, George, a few good books. One is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Professor Anthony Sutton, who documents that the Bolsheviks were financed by Wall Street. That's one book. Book number two is an author named Taylor Caldwell, who was very famous at one time. A lot of her novels were all these books based on fact. One of her novels was called Captains and Kings. That was a very famous movie years ago. Well, she wrote something called The Middle Class Must Not Fail. And she talked about how Marx never once railed against the rich. He railed against the bourgeoisie, like you, guys like me, although as a lawyer, I'm kind of half a leech, but, you know, I fall into that category. But he railed against those people who were challenging the two-tier system that they want to bring us back to, the reincarnation, if you will, of feudalism, where the middle class was the drawbridge on the moat. You had the lord in his castle and the serfs outside, separated by a moat with alligators in the water. Middle class and America and liberty, which is the key. Without liberty, doesn't matter what you want to do. You can't do anything without liberty. That is what they hate. And in the book, The Strawberry Statement, James Cunin, who was a member of SDS, you know, in the college riots back in the 60s, he writes about going to a convention of communists at the Waldorf Astoria. I mean, you can't make that up, the Waldorf Astoria, convention of communists. And he notices that all these Esso people, which is now ExxonMobil, are going around giving out checks to all the communist groups. And he's saying, what the hell is going on? This is the enemy. These are the filthy capitalists, and they're financing us because the middle class is potential competition. And they want to get rid of that.
Yeah. So coming full circle, if we look at everything that you just articulated beautifully, and we say to ourselves, okay, where are we now? I think the Marxists look back on let's say the failed state of Russia, communist Russia, and they truly, because a lot of people that believe in free market capitalism say, oh, well, communism doesn't work, just look at Russia, done deal. But see, they don't see it that way. They look at communist Russia and see that it wasn't communism failed, it was just that you started communism before Marx would have suggested it. They didn't allow capitalism to run its course. That was the problem. It wasn't communism. So I believe that potentially, and I think there's one of two things here. Let me just write this down because I'll come back to this in a moment. But potentially these central planners, I think, really favor Marxism. And it would make sense that, coming up in the school system, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States in today's day and age, and they can't come right out and say, well, we favor Marxism. So what they do is they come out and say, okay, well, we like this, something called, they package it in like a Trojan horse and call it the Great Reset Agenda, okay? But if you look at what the Great Reset Agenda potentially does, and what most likely does, it destroys a lot of the economic output, therefore goods and services, it decreases, which will force the central banks to print more money, and will also potentially destroy the commercial banking system in the process. And if that happens, then they've talked about a lot of digital currencies, a lot of central bank digital currencies. So you have us all having an account with the Fed, let's say, and so they're seeing your activity in real time, your transactions. You go to Starbucks, you spend $5, and the Fed or the Treasury has that information. It's able to collect that in real time and aggregate it for all 350 million Americans, plus all of the businesses and the entities. This is in the future. If we do, I believe we're going to get a central bank digital currency. If we do, that just means that all of us have bank accounts with that central entity. Okay. And then you look at another component of the Great Reset Agenda, and that's for AI to play a big role. And I'm not here to say I'm against AI. I think it's great, but in the wrong hands, I think it could be dangerous. And they see AI playing a big role. They also see, like, I don't know what they call them, but they're in essence chips that interact with the human body. And I don't know if their vision is to have them, in your hand or something like that, but it would
transhumanism.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the word they use, but it's something like that. So of course they paint a rosy picture. Oh, this is going to be fantastic. It's going to help us be smarter. It's going to help us understand our vital signs, and it's going to make us healthier and all these things. But if you look at some other blog posts the World Economic Forum has in their vision for 2030, let's say, some that I've outlined in my videos, you see this person walking through this urban society, with their bicycle and just drawing pictures and not really having to go to work, but all of their thoughts and their dreams, and these are not my words, this is on their website, you can read it. I'm happy to send you over a link email, and you can put it in the description of the video here. But all of our thoughts and dreams are being transmitted to this cloud, let's say, and then AI is crunching all of the data. And then if you just start thinking that you want spaghetti for dinner tonight, then all of a sudden a drone goes by the store, picks up your spaghetti and drops it off at your house, so you don't have to own anything. It's part of this whole thing people have been hearing, that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. That was straight from the World Economic Forum. They produced a video on it. And this is kind of their vision, right? Well, I just take and look at that and try to connect the dots, like you're saying, and say, okay, well, these people are obviously central planners. Now, whether you want to label them as Marxists or not, who knows? Obviously central planners. But if they are Marxists, then they believe the problem isn't with communism. That's what can take us to the next level. That's how we achieve this utopian society. That's how we improve the world. That's their belief system. But the problem is, if you look at Russia, we didn't do it early enough. And in Russia, we didn't have price signals. which you understanding Austrian economics, you know how important that is. To allocate resources efficiently, you have to have price signals, because price tells us how much of XYZ resource needs to be allocated and then to where it needs to be allocated. So this is one of the reasons Russia collapses. So now moving forward to the Great Reset, now that all of our thoughts are being submitted to the cloud and all of our transactions are going to what in essence is the cloud. It's all a central area online, let's say on these servers at the Fed or the Treasury. That's all. The AI is crunching all of this data, all of the transactions, every time you buy something at the grocery store, you fill your car up with gas, you pay your electric bill, your insurance, all of that data is going into this central system, along with all of your thoughts and dreams, right? So if you're a Marxist, you look at this and you're like, this is it. This is how we get to the promised land. This is our nirvana, because now we don't need free market capitalism to allocate scarce resources efficiently, because we have all the data we need, and we have AI that can allocate that resources better than human beings ever could. Therefore, we can now have this, let's call it a Marxist utopian society where we own nothing and we're much happier. Their words, not mine. And it's all managed much better, because we are stupid, dirty,
deplorables,
imperfect human beings in an imperfect world. But AI, on the other hand, is perfect, and therefore that's kind of, again, that's if they're Marxist. Now, if they're not Marxist, if they're just self-serving, whatever you want to call them, politicians, I think it's all about the Cantillon effect. So going back to them introducing policies that they know will reduce economic output, that means the central banks have to print more money. And the Cantillon effect says that those who are closest to the money printing get the money first before it can create consumer price or asset inflation. And I can promise you that Klaus and Bigglesworth and all the people at the IMF are right next to the money printers. So they know if they can trigger the money printing, they are going to get rich. So
as opposed to trickle down economics.
It trickles into Klaus's back pocket is
where it
trickles first and foremost. And it gives him not only the money, but the power. So again, I'm not saying that this is what's happening. There are no certainties, only probabilities. But if I was going to say, okay, here's two scenarios, which I think are most likely, it's either that they're Marxist, and that's how they see the world moving more towards central planning through AI and through a digital currency and big data, or they're just planning on the Cantillon effect, just destroying economic output, printing more money.
Yeah, well, that's what Manarino says. The second choice, that they absolutely want to wipe out the middle class. Now, to wind it down, because I have great respect for your time. I think the average guy listening to this is trying to figure it out. But probably what he's thinking is, George, with all this happening, I've worked all my life, and I'm finally getting to an age where I want to have a little bit of safety and security. What do I do with my savings? How do I protect myself economically? And also, how do I protect myself physically?
Yeah. Well, you've got to look at things that don't have counterparty risk. So precious metals, I mean, just that's kind of a no-brainer, especially right now too, because gold is kind of unloved. We're seeing interest rates go, and just for the viewers who might see this in the future, it is it's January 15th, 2021. So we're seeing interest rates, at least Treasury, the 10-year, go up a bit, and therefore real rates are going higher, and that's usually negative for gold. So you're seeing a pullback in gold, while at the same time the Fed's balance sheet is going to infinity and beyond. The deficit spending and stimulus will be permanent in my view. and that's going parabolic. So you've got a lot of tailwinds for gold and precious metals, but gold has actually gone down a bit. I think it's because the market sees interest rates going up, and usually that's kind of a headwind. So it could be a good opportunity, but I don't really look at the price of gold too much. I just try to set my portfolio in something I call 10-80-10. So 10% for insurance, that'd be physical gold, regardless of the price. And then 80% investments, things that pay you to own them, and 10% speculations. And that's how I just try to keep it simple, stupid. But if I'm the average Joe, I'm going to have some precious metals. And I'm not saying 100% of your portfolio at all. For me, like I said, 10%. And then also for the average Joe and Jane, if you do own a home, I would assume you have a mortgage. And if that's the case, I would strongly suggest making sure the mortgage was a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Because what I see coming down the pipeline over the long term, and anything could happen in 6 months, a year, but over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I see the dollar losing significant value in relationship to consumer goods and services. And so if the dollar is going down, that means consumer price inflation. And if inflation increases higher than the rate of your interest payment, then that's a transfer of wealth from the bank to you. So let's just say that you had a rental property as an example, and when you bought it today, it was cash flow positive, and you have a 30-year fixed rate loan, and let's say that it's at 3%. Well, you're being paid to short the dollar. The more the dollar loses value, the more purchasing power is transferred from the lender to you, because you're paying that loan back with devalued dollars, you see? And so I think it sounds just crazy to even say it out loud, but I think ironically, that's one way that the average person can protect their wealth is by having debt. I mean, it sounds crazy, but as long
Yeah,
as
you
it's
sound like Robert
security.
Kiyosaki now.
Well, Robert and I are real good buddies. Yeah, we talk about this stuff all the time. But I think that's, and then having a plan B as well. Unfortunately, what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation with the economy being really built on asset prices and asset bubbles, stock markets weren't meant to go straight up. They were meant to go up, and they were meant to go down. It's a market. And if we try to reduce the volatility in asset prices, i.e. stock market, the volatility, according to Chris Cole, and I totally am on board with this idea, 10 times smarter than I am, but he has this hypothesis that you cannot destroy volatility, you can only transfer it. So if you're trying to destroy the volatility in the stock market by constantly pushing it up with this monetary heroin, let's say, that volatility is going to show up somewhere else. And I think it shows up in social unrest. And I think that's what 2020 was all about, in my opinion. I think when you increase the delta between the haves and the have-nots, and you dramatically decrease the number of haves and increase the number of have-nots, and then you lock people up in a cage in their house for 9 months, 6 months, an entire year. And then you say when they do go outside and get a little bit of sunshine, now all of a sudden they have to wear a mask where you can't see anyone smile. You can't really communicate. And I know that sounds trivial to a lot of people, but we have to remember that we're social creatures at the end of the day. And if we don't get that human interaction, I think it really creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of subconscious stress. So you combine that with the wealth gap increasing substantially because the Fed trying to decrease the amount of volatility. And again, I think that's why you're seeing, whether it's the riots on the left or the right or whatever, I think that's what it's really about. That's the underlying cause. And unfortunately, in my opinion, it's most likely going to get worse because every single day that we do these stimulus checks, we continue to prop up the economy. Our economy our economy needs more and more of the stimulus and the artificially low interest rates, and it needs asset prices being higher, which is creating more volatility in society. And I hate to leave it on that, but I think that's kind of
That's
where
the
we're going.
Cantillon effect writ large.
Yeah, it is. It has a lot to do with the Cantillon effect. And then I think if I was an American and I didn't want to have a plan B, which included a second passport, which is what I suggest, that's kind of the direction that I like to go, to have the ability to go to other countries. But if that was not an option, at very least, I'd have an RV. I know it sounds kind of silly, but it's just a cheap way to put something in your driveway. And I mean, you can even rent it out on Airbnb. They rent out RVs, and cash flow it, but then have a good diesel truck. I like the mid '90s Ford pickups, the OBS, the 7.3 Power Strokes, and just fill it with food and just have that there for peace of mind. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And by the way, the diesel trucks really maintain their value. Those diesel trucks do. But then if it really hits the fan, as far as the social unrest and the society's volatility, then you've got a way just to go up to the mountains and reflect and try to figure out what your next move is, while all of those people that might not have been as prepared are right in the firing zone, let's say, in the urban areas.
I, as a Jew, bought a house in Israel, but Israel is now becoming as big a lockdown fascist state as the United States.
Yeah.
And so now that becomes very difficult, because my friends tell me, Bob, if you come to Israel, you're going to get arrested. Because Israel, they've already implemented what they call administrative detention. They arrested a friend of mine because of what he said, and it was like pre-crime, like the movie Minority Report.
Minority Report.
And
Yeah.
they said that he's likely to be a criminal. And they put him in jail for 6 months without charges. At least so far in the United States, if they arrest you, they have an obligation to tell you what it is you're accused of. So this is happening worldwide. And unfortunately, the only solution that I see is for people like yourself and myself and many others that we know, make common cause and either hang together or hang separately, as Ben Franklin said, because I see this thing getting a lot worse. And I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
You say the definition of an optimist is really, I'm sorry, the definition of a pessimist is really an optimist who actually knows the facts.
I've never heard of that one. That's good.
The other one is George Bernard Shaw. A person with accurate powers of observation is called a cynic by those who are deaf, dumb, and blind.
Yeah, that's right.
So, George, God bless you for what you do. I appreciate it. I can say publicly that you are a much bigger name than I am. And it was very nice of you to do this show. I really appreciate it. And for everybody out there, you need to subscribe to George's channel, not because he needs the money or he's paying me to say this, because I don't get paid to say anything, except if I'm in court. In fact, I represent, you mentioned the Chinese, I represent a lot of Chinese people, and I do mostly real estate transactions for them as a lawyer. You know what I tell them? Oh, hey, buddy, you don't know it, but you, when you came here, bought a round trip ticket. They look at me because they came, with a different concept of America. They have the old concept, and it's kind of like Mike Tyson. When Mike Tyson was fighting, he would go like this, and the opponent would fall down because his reputation went before him. The minute Buster Douglas knocked him out, he couldn't beat anybody practically after that.
All right.
So that is what America is, unfortunately. It's living on fumes. And the foundation, the Constitution, the Bible, the Federalist Papers, liberty, all those things that America was based on. I wrote a very well-read book. It was sold a lot back in the 1990. It was called Tune Into Success. And in the first part of the book, I have a guy telling Fidel Castro that he wants to be a lawyer. And Fidel Castro says, well, really, that's very nice. But I want you to cut the sugarcane in my fields. And he says, but Fidel, I want to be a lawyer. And Fidel says, okay, bang. So if you don't have a liberty, you have nothing. And we've got to stand up for liberty. And we've got to be like the Maccabees in the holiday of Hanukkah, who defeated the entire Greek Empire. Alexander the Great had died and generals were taking over. And these little band of very religious Jews defeated the entire empire because they were fearless. They had total belief. The Hebrew word for that is emunah, total faith. And once you have that kind of faith, you can go forward and not be afraid of anything because we're all going to die. And I tell people all the time, sometimes I'll counsel people, especially now, from the COVID nonsense, who are very depressed. As you mentioned earlier, it's affecting people psychologically. And I always tell them, why you want to commit suicide? You're going to die anyway. Why are you going to do the work? Let God do it. You know, but while we're here, let's stand for something or we're going to fall for anything. And so, George, I thank you very much. Everybody, George Gammon, the Rebel Capitalist, subscribe to his channel. He is an American treasure, hopefully an American institution in the future. I'd vote for you in a minute. And God bless you. And if you ever get out this way, I don't know if you ever come to the East Coast, but if you ever do, I owe you a good steak dinner if we're not still shut down.
Well, thank you very much. And I know it's probably Friday night your time. So in closing, Shabbat Shalom.
Oh, wow. You know some words, huh? That's great. God bless you, man. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Take care.